How many times have you seen somebody, right after something happens that they really like, say, oh, there is a God in heaven? As if there wouldn't be a God in heaven if things didn't turn out the way that I prefer. You know, one of the reasons why people frequently give for why they reject God is it has to do with the existence of evil and the fact that things don't turn out the way they would want them to turn out. To this day, I hear people say, where was God on 9/11 or during some other tragedy? There's a lot of good answers to that question. You could say where God was, but apart from those answers, if you just think for a second about the question itself, where was God on 9/11? That question presupposes that God is answerable to man, right? And if God is answerable to man, that must mean that man is greater than God. Is man greater than God? Well, let's just grant that. Just for the sake of argument, let's say, yeah, okay, man is greater than God. God is answerable to man for what he does. He has to give an account to us because we're greater than him. Let's just consider that for a second. If that's the case, then the real question is, where was man on 9/11? Right? Well, where was man on that day? Well, some of them were crashing planes into buildings, trying to murder as many people as they possibly could. Innocent people that they've never met. That's where man was. And you might say, oh, well, that's just the bad ones. What about the good ones? Where were they? Well, where were they? Why didn't they prevent this tragedy from happening? Why didn't they do something about it to keep it from happening? Because they didn't have enough power? They didn't have enough knowledge? They weren't able to prevent it from happening? Well, if that's the case, then maybe man's not greater than God after all. Maybe man's not that great. The human race, if they aren't even good enough to prevent themselves from mass murder, and they're not even powerful enough to prevent the bad ones from committing mass murder, maybe they're not greater than God after all. Which means maybe they're not in a position to demand answers from God and demand an accounting from God after all. So back to the question of where was God then on 9/11 or during any other tragedy? Why didn't he do something to prevent it? I'll tell you where God was. He was on his throne, reigning in heaven, working all things together for good for those who love him and to redeem his people with glorious salvation at the cost of his own son, with incredible patience so that you and I could be included in that salvation. That's where God was. And what does mankind do in return? They live their lives as though God didn't exist, utterly ignore him. You know, you turn on the news, how many times on the news have you ever heard them attribute anything to God? He's just absolutely, utterly irrelevant to our culture. And even with those notions that mankind has in him of the way things ought to be, they find they not only lack the power to prevent evil from happening in the world, they lack the power from eliminating evil even from their own hearts. Not one human being is even capable of doing that. So, maybe mankind isn't that great after all. Maybe God isn't answerable to mankind after all, and so maybe we should stop demanding answers from God as if he were answerable to us and start concerning ourselves with that day when we will have to answer to God.